if we imagine the spectrum between the level and type of economic interdependence we have now and full-on economic decoupling, what are some of the intermediate solutions that might be satisfactory? We hear a lot that the United States and China are embarking upon a new Cold War, and superficially the comparison makes sense. We are seeing the contours of a long-term, multifaceted competition emerge between the two countries, just the way that Washington and Moscow were engaged in a long-term, multifaceted competition during the Cold War. But I think that there are important differences, and it's important both for analytical reasons and prescriptive reasons to enumerate some of those. A first difference is the Soviet Union was basically quarantined from the U.S.-led post-war order. China, on the other hand, particularly since 1978, it's been one of the principal beneficiaries of integration into the U.S.-led order. There really wasn't also much in the way of economic exchanges or cultural exchanges between Washington and Moscow, and deliberately so. But if you look today at the U.S.-China relationship, they have a two-way trading relationship that runs in the hundreds of billions of dollars. Last year it reached $660 billion. If you look at international student enrollment at American institutions of higher learning, China accounts fully for 1/3 of those students. So there's a much more robust set of economic and cultural linkages between the two countries. China doesn't harbor kind of a missionary zeal to promulgate its ideology. It doesn't harbor pretensions to a universal ideology in the way that the Soviet Union did. And in fact, the Soviet Union not only harbored such pretensions, but it actively fomented chaos and revolution and upheaval around the world to inculcate that ideology across vast stretches of the world. And the Soviet Union also posed a kind of a frontal assault, a militaristic assault against the prevailing order, an ideological assault against the prevailing order. China is more of a selective revisionist, and that is to say, it is certainly chipping away at certain elements of the U.S.-led system, and it wants to be seen as a player within the post-war order on par with its economic heft. It's agnostic about certain other elements of the post-war order, and then outside of that system, it's establishing kind of a parallel architecture. So if you look at the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the Belt and the Road Initiative. So China is a selective revisionist. It poses a more gradualist challenge to the post-war order. Another important difference is China is far more economically capable than the Soviet Union ever was. There's a very important study put out by Andrew Krepinevich at the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments, and he makes the point that prior to China, the United States had never before confronted a competitor that ever attained more than 40% of its gross domestic product. Well, China is already way above that level. China is well over 3/5 the size of the American economy, and that proportion will continue to grow. There are many other differences that I can enumerate, but there's one last difference that I would enumerate, or that I would articulate, between Cold War competition and U.S.-China competition today, and that is that in the Cold War, unless you were an explicitly non-aligned country such as India, it would have been inconceivable for a country to say, I'll do some business with the Americans, I'll do some business with the Soviets. You either picked a side or you would have a side imposed on you. We see the exact opposite at work today. When Washington or Beijing goes to middle countries and exhorts them to make a choice, they say thank you but no thank you. They want to benefit from U.S.-China competition. They want to maximize their freedom of strategic maneuver. So there are other differences that I could articulate, but suffice it to say that we should scrutinize this new Cold War framework a little bit more rigorously. So that would be point one that I would want to make. The second point is, amid all of this talk about a new Cold War, potentially even the prospect of economic decoupling, I think that one of the biggest imperatives, economic imperatives and strategic imperatives for both countries is, how do we restructure economic interdependence? Economic interdependence is not an unalloyed good, and it does introduce security risks, which we've seen with some of the charges against Huawei. There are security risks inherent in economic interdependence, but we should be careful in the United States of what we wish for. I think that if we were to sever our economic ties, our technological ties with China completely, we would actually end up with a much more difficult problem on our hands. And so how do we restructure economic interdependence in a way, or deconstruct it in a way, so that we preserve the benefits, the commercial benefits, and these take the form of low-price goods that Americans purchase when they go to Walmart or when they go to Target. There are a number of, or the creation of jobs here in the United States. How do we preserve the commercial benefits, the trading benefits, the investment benefits, and mitigate some of the security risks? So if we imagine the spectrum between the level and type of economic interdependence we have now and full-on economic decoupling, what are some of the intermediate solutions that might be satisfactory to both countries. And then that brings me to my third point, which I alluded to somewhat earlier. As difficult as it is to deal with China now, and there are an enormous number of complications and serious complications that arise in dealing with a resurgent China that is antithetical to the United States in many ways. But again, we should be careful what we wish for. As difficult as it is to deal with China now as a very complex competitor, it would be, I think, exponentially more difficult to deal with a China that is significantly less dependent on the United States. It's more economically independent. It's found alternative suppliers for high-tech inputs, and it's economically in the aggregate far larger and far less invested in interdependence with the United States and far less invested in the post-war order. So yes, it is challenging to deal with China right now. That challenge will only grow in scale and in complexity, but better to have that challenge than to deal with a China that is far larger and far less constrained by economic interdependence and integration into the post-war order.